So we have 25 minutes for each presentation, then a 5-minute Q&A session, and then we have a moderated discussion afterwards. So Emily, the floor is yours. Looking forward to having a good and very interesting presentation.
Great. Let me just get this going. Is that coming through okay?
I think I can see it perfectly.
Okay, great. The dual screen thing is always challenging for me. Okay, well, thanks so much for having us. I have 3 co-authors. I think some of them are actually on the call. And our presentation is Uneven Geographies of Financial Vulnerability in U.S. Higher Education. And I didn't even put the whole thing on the slide because it was such a long title. And yeah, my co-authors are Ishara Casellas Connors at Texas A&M and Jane Pollard and Jessa Loomis from Newcastle University. And we're starting out in this presentation, so really eager to hear your feedback. So all of us are currently experiencing what the pandemic is doing to higher education, including budget cuts, campus closures, kind of some wholesale consolidation of majors and departments at some institutions. So the news all around is not so good, but it's important to remember that U.S. higher education was in conditions of financial crisis long before COVID-19. So closures and mergers of U.S. higher education institutions have been escalating in the past 10 years. And I'm going to refer to higher education institutions as HEIs. So this map is just since 2016. This is from the Chronicle of Higher Education. And it shows you how many public and private nonprofit colleges have closed or merged or have announced plans to do this since 2016, the most being in Massachusetts, but it's kind of all over the country. And the public and political discourse around closures and mergers often paints this as the result of financial mismanagement or the lack of demand for a certain kind of educational offering or the need for consolidation in the sector. And many states are getting interested in this because of the effects on students whose institutions might suddenly close or lose accreditation. Yet the effects of higher education financial uncertainty and closures are felt very unevenly. So sometimes the sort of mainstream imaginary of higher education is like a private liberal arts college or a Research One university, but those kinds of institutions are actually the small minority of the diverse types of institutions across the US. So if we look more closely at which systems are serving which students, we can begin to see this. For example, 75% of students in the US attend public institutions, 80% of racialized students attend a public or community college, and most students do not leave their home region to go to university. So in sum, we have this landscape of systems that are aimed at a lot of different kinds of students. And there are a couple more ways that financial uncertainty is felt unevenly. First, research has documented how public and private institutions experience uncertainty differently, depending on factors like how tuition dependent they are and what kinds of populations they serve. There's also a big difference in where institutions are located, so like their relationship between state finances and institutional finances. But the vector of inequality that I'm primarily going to talk about in this presentation is around race, specifically the mandate of different higher education institutions to serve racially minoritized student populations. So probably you've heard of historically Black colleges and universities, and those are just one category of federally designated minority serving institutions, which have either a dedicated mission to serve racially minoritized students or enroll a majority of racially minoritized students. And just to clarify, when I'm using the term racially minoritized, I'm referring to students who are pushed to the margins of education through structural forces. So groups that are different in race and as a result of social constructs like racism have less power or representation compared to other members or groups in society. So minority serving institutions are one of the primary drivers of equity in educational access. They are mobility drivers and produce large percentages of professionals in this country who are racialized. And they often provide a supportive environment beyond simply education. So these kind of wraparound services such as personal attention from administrators and faculty that are intended to create a really supportive atmosphere for students who maybe are the first in their families to attend university and face other barriers in society. Many also serve students local to their communities, which underlies their role as regional economic pillars for providing employment, training a labor force, and bringing enrichment to communities. Yet also, on a whole, these institutions have fewer institutional financial resources. They are more reliant on tuition, they have smaller endowments, they have lower amounts of alumni donations, and research has recently shown that when they borrow money, they face higher interest rates than predominantly white institutions do. So in sum, even before COVID-19, these institutions were struggling. 1 in 10 HBCUs, for example, is on the US Department of Education's watch list of schools with financial problems. And they were closing and merging at a faster rate before the pandemic than predominantly white institutions. So in this research project, we are interested in the implications for inequality that are coming from this uptick in HEI and specifically MSI closures and mergers. And we see this as symptoms of the broader landscape of continual financial uncertainty faced by US higher education. So we're looking here at processes that are facing this geographically dispersed sector, but processes that have tended to be synthesized more at the level of the institution or in terms of higher education as a whole, and less with a sensitivity to this geography or to this broader racialized landscape of institutional financial precarity. So we're looking to synthesize several processes here: this racialized landscape, ongoing financialization in the sector, and then the function of higher education as these large, locally embedded institutions that are important to the economy and the wider community life of cities and regions where they are located. And we're going to bring 3 literatures together to answer these questions. So with this team of 4, one of us is an education scholar and the other 3 are geographers. And from education studies, we are drawing a focus on equity and racialization in the landscape of higher ed, as well as a more fine-grained focus on institutional accountability to different communities such as students and state funders. And as I mentioned, this has led us to focus specifically on MSIs, given our interests in equity and inequality. From the financialization literature, we're examining this transition in revenue structures, particularly the trend toward increased debt financing of institutions. And we are interested in specifically in how financialization is reflected in institutional accreditation, which I'm going to talk a little bit more in a bit. And then finally, we're thinking about the role of HEIs as locally embedded institutions, thinking about how regions matter to this uneven financial landscape and how a higher education relates to the region going forward. So now I'm going to talk about each of these pieces in turn. So first, I'm going to give an overview of what the ed literature has to say. So this literature foregrounds this racialized landscape and brings this equity lens. So focusing on equity means foregrounding the significant disparities in access to resources and opportunities that underpin US higher education. And this map can help us think about this. So this is a current landscape of MSIs today, and these include a lot of different kinds of institutions. So there's tribal colleges or universities, which are controlled or chartered by Native American tribes. Related but not on this map are Native American non-tribal institutions, which serve a population of at least 10% Native students, but aren't formally associated with a tribe. There are Alaskan Native or Native Hawaiian serving institutions, which serve either 20% or 10% Alaskan or Hawaiian Natives. There are Hispanic serving institutions, which serve at least 25% Hispanic students. Most of these are in California and the US Southwest, and most of them are community colleges. There are the historically Black colleges and universities. These were specifically created to primarily educate African American students. And they have a very old history, sort of prior to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. There are predominantly Black institutions, which aren't legally HBCUs, but they serve at least 40% African American students. And then finally, there are Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions, which serve at least 10% of these populations. So you can already see on this map a very uneven landscape. Institutions that serve different groups tend to be concentrated in different regions. Some states have more MSIs than others. As I said, there's, most of the Hispanic serving institutions are in California and then the Southwest. A lot of the tribal colleges are in the Midwest. A lot of the HBCUs and predominantly Black institutions are kind of in the Southeast and then up the East Coast. Most of these institutions are public, but not all. Another thing to note is that for all of the designations except for HBCUs, part of the designation is that at least 50% of the undergraduate population is low income, meaning that they can receive federal needs-based assistance. So related to our research questions, the education literature, specifically more on HEI finance, has noted that MSIs are more likely to close than predominantly white institutions. And there's been a little bit of attention to the racialized nature of institutional finances, for example, showing that MSIs are paying higher interest rates, and also that they do worse when evaluated against standards that are used or pegged to predominantly white institutions. And this is showing that there's this elevated level of scrutiny, and oftentimes it's very inadvertent when policymakers are evaluating MSIs according to the same standards they use for these more homogeneous institutions. So our big takeaway here is that in the education literature, the institution has been the traditional unit of analysis. And so what we're kind of trying to think towards is how do we get at some of these larger processes, more facing MSIs and higher education as a sector. So now I'm going to talk about what the financialization literature can bring to bear on some of these trends facing US higher education. So financialization is commonly defined as the increasing influence of finance in the economy, both in terms of how profits are derived and also in terms of how systems and institutions are governed. So sort of taking that second piece, the literature on financialization has a lot to say on institutional governance that can be applied to higher education institutions. So there hasn't been a lot written specifically on this, but we can take what we understand about institutional governance under financialization and then look at HEIs. So we can think about how regulatory structures are being reworked through systems that may prioritize investor profits over organizational missions. How is this reshaping governance strategies around financial goals? And then in different sectors of the economy, how finance has begun to drive policy more than supporting access to public goods like education. So in thinking about MSI-related finances through this literature, we're connecting management practices used to mitigate financial risk and uncertainty at the institutional scale with a broader operational environment that's created by financial actors' determinations about what constitutes financial risk and institutional vulnerability. So a major part of this, for example, is credit ratings agencies that have a lot of control about institutional futures by deciding, how able institutions are to borrow. And this is really important in an environment where institutional strategies are more and more organized around debt, around taking on debt to finance various things. And as I mentioned, we're specifically interested in accreditation and the effects of financialization on accreditation. So for those of you who are maybe not from the US, this is a system that is basically in place to ensure external quality review. And it is separate from government, and it's used to scrutinize colleges and universities for quality assurance and quality improvement. And it's a system that's carried out by private nonprofit organizations, and the federal government relies on accreditation to assure the quality of institutions and programs to which government funds are provided. And so regarding these access to funds, the US Department of Education has certain standards for higher education institutions' fiscal and administrative capacity. And part of this is assuring students that these institutions aren't going to suddenly close or lose capacity. And it involves taking a really close look at institutional credit ratings and financial statements. So in practice, accreditation often includes an attention to the mission of different HEIs, but not so much attention to the nature of financial systems themselves, and including how institutions are subject to racialized financial disparities. So little has been written about how the specifically financial side of accreditation may entrench inequality. So this is something that we're really interested in pursuing a bit further. So in sum, financialization as a process is working through this heterogeneous landscape of higher education. And institutions in this landscape are differentially positioned to resist or absorb the pressures of financialization. And this has a really huge effect on what seems possible in terms of management and strategy when crises arise, such as COVID-19, or also longer-term trends of closures and mergers in this sector. So then last, I'm going to talk a little bit about the regional implications of all of this. So what can geography show us? So the education literature has talked about higher education relationship with states, but a little less about relationships with regions and communities. So thinking, from regional studies, why might the region be important to understanding inequality in this sector? So there's a small bit of regional studies literature around this with authors such as John Goddard, thinking about HEIs as locally and regionally embedded institutions. So you can think about the EDS, MEDS, and BEDS economic development strategy that some cities and regions with a lot of higher education depend on. We can kind of think about this from two perspectives. So first, how MSIs might matter to the region. So we talked a little bit about, some areas of the country have a lot of certain kinds of MSIs, some have very few. And the regional studies literature can help explore the relationship between internal transformations of HEIs and their engagement with the wider dynamics of regional economic systems. And then in terms of how regions matter to MSIs, regions are this dynamic socioeconomic environment that has a really large bearing on the operations and survival of HEIs, from their missions to their student base to their funding environment, et cetera. And so this is providing a different vantage point for thinking about cuts made to HEIs or what happens when they close. For example, if we think about institutional financial uncertainty from the perspective of HEIs function in the local labor market. So what may appear to be cost savings on a university balance sheet also might represent an erosion of support for local workers or a reduction in the purchasing power of local workers if they're laid off or experience wage cuts when university budgets are cut. So this means that closure means something very different depending on geographical context. There may be a very different narrative in the Northeast where we see a lot of closures than in other parts of the country. And when it comes specifically to MSIs, depending on the region, there is a lot of unevenness in the extent to which these institutions have a key community function and what their function is. So some lingering questions we have here: how will we understand regional impacts on when there is one MSI versus a lot of MSIs in a region? How do we analyze the difference between different places there? And then conceptualizing MSIs in relation to regional economies. Thinking, for example, how do we bound the region in the era of online education? So what is sort of the implications of closures? These things are probably evolving very quickly. So then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're thinking about measuring inequality in this very complex environment. So we're thinking about inequality both in terms of the unevenness of these effects, but also the equity implications, of course, according to three general scales. So from the education literature, we're looking really a fine-grained focus on institutions, about how they manage, how they govern themselves under these conditions. From financialization, we're thinking about the larger sector. So what are the other actors that kind of constrain or allow MSIs to survive, accreditation, credit ratings, government, etc. And then again, the wider regional implications of this very kind of fast evolving uneven landscape. So operationalizing these interests. We are planning a qualitative study informed by secondary data collected by the US Department of Education. So this industry standard data is the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, and it's typically released about 12 to 18 months after it's collected, and it provides a really detailed look at financial data for different institutions. So research using data like this has so far reported on broad trends, and it hasn't been as sensitive to the unique context in which MSIs operate. So we can get data on their outcomes, but less on like what they're sort of dealing with and how they make decisions. So our research is employing methods that allow us to capture more of these decision-making processes about how MSIs are managing in this environment. And to do this, we're going to pursue interviews. And these are really valuable when seeking to understand decision-making, especially in a financial context, in these periods of social and economic change. So we're going to talk to MSI financial decision makers, but also decision makers that govern the sector, such as accreditors, credit rating agencies. And as we work towards developing case studies, we're going to talk to hopefully regional and local governments and other municipal stakeholders in this relationship between MSIs and their regions. And ultimately, we hope to develop some case studies that give us a range of understanding of the different regional contexts, including a range of financial profiles, locations, public-private status, institutional size, population served. So there's a lot of different things that go into this relationship that will go into how we determine what our case studies will be. Just to wrap up, I've talked through our project trying to conceptualize inequality stemming from multiple processes of racialization and financial precarity in the US system of higher education, always kind of holding attention to what is the function of different institutions. So we can't think of higher education just as one thing. What are the populations served? What is the regional context? And there are implications here for the ability of minority serving institutions to continue their equity missions, but also with COVID-19 and ongoing financial crisis, probably what's coming is a wholesale shift in discussions about the value of higher education to society. So the uneven and ongoing financial uncertainty faced by higher ed is symptomatic of tensions over the traditional role of higher education. So questions like, is higher education still a ticket to upward mobility for everyone, which is really what a lot of these minority serving institutions are based around. But is it for others maybe more of a ticket just to over indebtedness? So there's a lot of information coming out now about racialized disparities in student debt, about who defaults, about who actually graduates, having a lot of student debt. So thinking here, there's so many implications for the missions of institutions, and we need to understand more about which institutions are going to be saved by policy or accreditors or donors versus those that might be allowed to close and lose accreditation. And then, what are the implications for the communities they serve? Thinking both very place-based, but then, in other ways as well, and the equity mission of minority serving institutions. So I will leave it there, and I welcome questions and suggestions, as do my co-authors.
Okay, thank you, Emily, for this very interesting presentation. So I think we have 5 minutes left for short Q&A. So if there are any questions, just write them down in our chat. So otherwise, I've got maybe only small question to you. Afterwards, we're going to this discussion. So are there any, is there a support from the government now because of COVID-19 for the MSIs, or could you say something about that? Maybe I missed that point.
Yeah,
okay.
So there was this big CARES Act that provided support for higher education generally. And so I don't exactly know what the formula was, but different institutions received different levels of support. There have been small measures aimed at HBCUs specifically, and I would say probably because of the attention to racial inequality that kind of grew out of this summer. A lot of institution and a lot of campaign promises have emerged specifically around HBCUs, but there's been a lot less attention to the other kinds of minority serving institutions and sort of how precarious a lot of them are and how COVID-19 might sort of influence their futures. And if I have co-authors on the call who might have a little more to say on this too, if you want to chat.
Okay. So is there a plan to not only doing a qualitative study, but also to support qualitative findings with a more quantitative study, or is this hard to do that because of lack of data? Or
yeah, the lag in data I think is really challenging, especially if we're wanting to look like specifically at COVID-19. We won't have like a lot of institutional financial data for like 12 to 18 months, and who knows if it will be delayed, by COVID-19. And so what we're planning to do is really try to jump into this right now and look at how institutions are managing now. And that's where the qualitative approach comes in.
okay.
And talking to decision makers. And there have been some surveys, but not with attention specifically to MSIs.
Yeah, so it's somehow interesting to see how dependent the system, the education system, is on financial situation, and it's like kind of different, completely different to what we have in Germany, for instance. So so okay, thank you so much. Maybe some other question after we have our second presentation, which is given by Philip Kerner from the University of Bremen. And he will present as I mentioned before, a paper on not on education economics, but on green technologies and regional performance. So and a kind of other topic, but nevertheless interesting. So the floor is yours, Philip. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Torben, for your nice introduction. Let me share the screen. I guess you should all see the slides now. Okay, here we go. Yeah, thank you very much for your introduction. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to present one of our ongoing research papers to you and to take part at this workshop. This is really a work in progress, so I believe there's a lot to do and a lot of potential for improvements, which I will be very happy to discuss with you later. This is a joint paper together with Tobias Wendler and Torben Klarl. Both are affiliated at the University of Bremen, Germany, as well as I am. Okay, the talk today will have the basic outline, which you can see here. So let's jump right into the introduction. I'd like to start with a quotation which can be found on the website of the European Commission, specifically on the website of the Eco-Innovations Action Plan. And there it says, eco-innovation is therefore a powerful instrument that combines reduced negative impact on the environment with a positive impact on the economy and society. And this statement is just one example of the expectation that is attributed to green technologies in providing economic growth, in addition to the possible benefits for the natural environment. And indeed, green technologies are often attributed to play a prominent role in achieving environmental sustainability, at least by reducing the costs of abatement or the costs of climate change mitigation. On the other hand, green technologies are named, for example, very recently by Stuckey and Wörter, in one breath with ICT technologies and nanotechnologies as potential new growth technologies, which may strongly increase economic returns. And here we want to focus on the latter aspect. In our view, it's an interesting question, since although the positive effects of knowledge on economic growth are quite established, but only few studies consider green technologies on a broad base, and evidence for European regions is scarce so far. So this brings us to our research question, which is, are there positive private returns to green technologies in European NUTS 2 regions? And with private we mean here within region returns, to distinguish it from returns that occur through possible spillovers. So we are really interested in the returns that occur within the region, and not the returns that occur through spillovers in neighboring regions. The empirical literature on green technologies was mainly focused on the firm level and the country sector level so far. So the firm level evidence points to lower returns compared to other innovation, or to positive effects only for specific types of green technologies. And the country sector level evidence points to, positive, albeit small returns, but also to the possibility of a U-shaped relationship, meaning that green technologies can only have positive effects after a certain tipping point, after enough knowledge is accumulated. When estimating the returns to knowledge, a recent methodological advancement is to explicitly take the role of cross-section dependence into account. And this is another very, very important strand of the literature, because you all know that knowledge spillovers are a very important phenomenon in the analysis of knowledge and the economic returns of knowledge. And recent studies stress that knowledge spillovers, but also other common shocks, common factors that induce cross-section dependence, have to be accounted for in order to obtain consistent estimates. And in this vein, Ertuğ and Musulesi highlight the importance to account for unobserved factors, even if a specific spillovers channel is explicitly included. And other evidence on the country sector level, other studies in which unobserved spillovers are controlled for, find, for example, surprisingly, no significant private returns to R&D, or sometimes at best modest private returns. So for our empirical setup, it's very important to control for spillovers. And basically, our baseline model starts with a well-established production function approach. So as I said, we want to have a look at this phenomenon on a broad basis at first. So we have a regional production function here. We index with I the European NUTS 2 regions, which is our panel unit, and T indexes years. So we have a panel of European NUTS 2 regions for several years. And this is otherwise a very basic production function of Cobb-Douglas type. This is logarithmized to have it in this nice form, in this nice estimable form. And basically we have as a dependent variable gross value added, or log gross value added. We include labor inputs, capital inputs, and then we have what we are really interested in, the green knowledge stock, which is separated from a non-green knowledge stock. And these two enter the equation. And as you can see here, this basic type of equation does not include any spillover channels. And that's why if one would estimate such an equation, one would have most likely biased estimates, because the error term then would contain cross-section dependence in form of those omitted sources of spillovers. This could be spatial lags of the knowledge stocks, that is, the knowledge stocks of neighboring regions, or it could also be induced by global underlying factors which drive, for example, a common technological component, a common oil price component, something like this. So we consider general model in which the error term might contain both sources of cross-section dependence. Here you can see the error term E is decomposed into 3 parts essentially. One part is in red, is marked red here or highlighted red, which is a common factor structure, and this is a typical example of strong dependence, strong cross-section dependence. And we have as an example, a spatial error process in highlighted here in blue, which is an example of weak dependence. And to clarify the terms here, weak and strong dependence are really just the degree of cross-section dependence. If you think of cross-section dependence as the correlation across units, then weak and strong cross-section dependence simply refer to the degree at which this cross-sectional correlation approaches 0 or does not approach 0 if n, the panel unit, goes to infinity. And if we have unaccounted strong cross-section dependence in the error term, this might disturb first-order properties of standard panel estimators. This can be thought of as a kind of omitted variable bias. Now, in practice, there may be very different degrees of cross-section dependence, ranging from independence to strong dependence. And we at first adopt diagnostics to estimate the degree of it, and then to choose an appropriate model. Here you can see the results for the tests. And I should first explain what the tests indicate. We have this alpha hat, which is the estimated exponent of cross-section dependence. And this is just a measure which is between 1 and 0. And 1 indicates the highest degree of cross-section dependence, 0 indicates independence, cross-sectional independence. And this can be estimated. So we can gauge the degree of cross-section dependence with that. The second one is the CD statistic, which has the null hypothesis of weak dependence, namely that alpha is in the range of 0 to 0.5. And the CD statistic you can see here, this is standard normally distributed. So it follows standard confidence intervals. And what we can see here is that it is way above the standard normal critical values. So we can pretty safely reject the null hypothesis of weak dependence, meaning that strong dependence is potentially an issue here, which is then backed up by the estimate of alpha, which is close to 1 in all the estimations and includes 1 in all but one case. So the basic insight from that is that we have to deal with strong dependence in order to get valid estimates, and strong dependence can be very nicely dealt with within the common correlated effects estimator developed by Pesaran in 2006. And in essence, there the cross-sectional averages of dependent and independent variables are used to approximate the common factors. And this is a very nice approach because we do not have to make any assumptions on the form of the spillovers. So we do not have to pose any structure that we might not know a priori on the nature of those channels. And we still allow for remaining weak dependence in the error term, which is not disturbing the estimation results. Okay, we have several. So we have a pooled version and the mean group version. Just to show you the terms for the table, which will appear on the next slide. And we have some other estimators which are commonly used just to get a comprehensive view. Okay, the data, we have a panel, we collected a panel of 270 European NUTS 2 regions over 25 years between 1991 and 2015. We construct both knowledge stocks with patent data, where the green technologies are classified according to IPC classes. The green inventory lists the IPC classes which classify technologies to be green. And we assign them to the industry sector with the SCHMOC tables because we rely on the industry sector. Labor inputs are total hours worked in the industry, capital inputs, gross fixed capital formation in the industry, and gross value added in the industry as dependent variable, all obtained from Cambridge Econometrics. For later use, I just briefly introduce here a measure of green specialization, which we apply for some maps and for some exercises later on, which is basically just the share of a region's green knowledge to the sum of green knowledge over all regions, and this is in relation, put into relation to the share of a region's non-green knowledge to the average or to the sum of non-green knowledge in all regions. Okay, then let's have a look at the first results. Oh no, let's at first look at the maps. Here you can see, which gives a nice overview about the sample. These are all regions we include in our sample, except for some which are in the Atlantic Ocean, which would make the map quite unreadable. So this is our basic sample, and we see the labor productivity here for 1991 to 2003 and 2004 to 2015. And we see, what we can see is a clear regional pattern, which is not surprising. And we have those regional disparities or the spatial distribution, which is mostly familiar to most of you, I guess. Here, the green knowledge stocks deflated or divided by labor inputs. You can see that we also have a clear spatial pattern of green knowledge, and that there's also decent change in the pattern. So the core region in terms of green knowledge seems to be Central Europe, and also the Scandinavian countries seem to have high stocks of green knowledge. This is the green specialization measure for the regions, and here we see a more dispersed distribution, and this might relate to a backdrop in the measure which I will introduce or talk to you about later on. Okay, these are the estimation results from the basic production function, and you can see here in the highlighted rows that in all but one approach we find a positive and significant effect of non-green knowledge, except here for one estimation method, it ranges at about 0.1 on average, I guess. In comparison, we have no positive effect, no significantly positive effect for green knowledge. I will skip the diagnostics for now. Maybe you can turn to them if you have questions regarding them. Okay, to summarize the first or the main results. So the coefficients of the non-green knowledge stock are significantly positive in all but one approaches, as I just said, and the coefficient of the green knowledge stock is negative or not significantly different from 0 in all approaches. These findings are generally robust against different methods to assign patents to regions. We have used the inventor's address, but we've also considered applicants' addresses. They are robust against different methods to calculate the stock, against the use of lagged values of all the inputs, and also against using a calculated capital stock instead of gross fixed capital formation. Furthermore, in an exercise, we have included a quadratic term to test the U-shaped relationship that has been found on the sectoral level, and we have no evidence for a U-shaped relationship here. Furthermore, if we split the sample in different tranches, we can observe no positive effect in both an EU 15 and a non-EU 15 subgroup, and also no significant effect in a subgroup where we split a sample according to being green specialized or not. Now we have also made a small extension where we looked at if knowledge or green knowledge predict convergence in GDP per capita. So far, we've just looked at the average returns, and in this approach, which is very similar but still a little bit different, we looked at the question if green knowledge predicts convergence in GDP per capita. And to realize this, we've applied a convergence clustering approach developed in Phillips and Sewell, 2007. And in essence, it assumes that there is a common growth component, and then it tests whether regions converge towards this common component. And these considerations can be shown pretty nicely with this transition coefficient. So the cross-sectional average, or it is the transition coefficient is basically the share of each region's level of log per capita, GDP per capita, to the average level of GDP per capita. And if growth convergence, if we would see growth convergence, this should converge to 1. Now, after we've identified convergence clubs, we can check for conditioning factors for club membership, which can be identified with an ordered logit approach, and we have done exactly that. This is the table for the convergence approach, the convergence in GDP per capita, and we can see here that for the whole sample of all 270 regions, we observed divergence. So the regions diverge in terms of GDP per capita. Divergence is, divergence, or the test has the null hypothesis of convergence such that anything that is below minus 1.65 in the t-statistic indicates divergence. So we have divergence for the whole sample, but by applying this clustering approach, we could find 3 convergence clusters, and they are basically very much related to states of development. So we have 93 regions in the first cluster which converge to each other, which have the highest degree of average GDP per capita in log GDP per capita in 1992. And then we have some kind of average region or average group, which has almost the same average GDP per capita in 1992 as the whole sample, and also in 2015. And then we have another group which also converges to each other, but which is kind of the below average group. So these groups converge to each other, but not kind of in the whole sample if you would look at all regions together. Here you can see graphically the different clubs. The club 1 is the highest income club that shows convergence. Club 2 is the middle club or the medium club, the average club, and club 3 is the below average club. Okay, now we can check with those ordered logit approaches if what factors determine kind of the selection or the probability to be in a certain club. This can be seen here, and so we control for various initial conditions in 1992, and we control also for green specialization, which is the average value over all years and not the initial value. What you can see here is that GDP per capita is, or the initial level of GDP per capita is a very strong and predictor of the club. So these are all the marginal effects on the probability to be in a certain club, evaluated at the mean of all variables. So the interpretation is if one variable changes by a unit, at the mean of all other variables, the probability of belonging to club 1, for example, here is then much higher if initial GDP per capita is raised by one unit. We see that besides GDP per capita, hours worked in the industry per capita is a significant predictor for the clubs, and also non-green knowledge in the industry. But again, green knowledge in the industry is not a good predictor for the club membership. Also, green specialization is not a good predictor for club membership. So this kind of gives broadly similar results to the same approach, but from kind of different angle. Okay, to summarize and conclude the talk for today, we find no evidence of positive private returns to green technology development for those 270 European NUTS 2 regions on a broad empirical basis. And a possible explanation relates, of course, to the double externality problem of green technologies, which states that knowledge has known to be public goods nature, for which reason knowledge spillovers might occur. And on the other hand side, the second externality, which is addressed in the double externality problem, is that most environmental harm is not priced or is not priced by the market, such that there's a lack of private incentives for provision, but also for firms a lack of private incentives to buy or to pay for those green technologies. Such that a possible explanation is that there was no sufficient market yet, because especially in the period we considered, of course, environmental harm was not sufficiently priced, and maybe it will some day in the future. But currently, we see developments in this direction, right, with emission taxes and or emission trading systems and something like that. Furthermore, of course, since we have those broad base, green technology development might not have an effect per se, that is on average, but only when we have specific regional capabilities or regions fulfill specific conditions. So we might not find an average effect because regions are just very different, and green technology development hinges on many factors that we cannot identify with a broad approach like this. In this regard, an interesting avenue for further research might be to look at a more sophisticated measure of green specialization that is more in line with the well-known smart specialization concept, that in a way that it is linked to existing capabilities and has other dimensions which are important as well. So with that being said, thanks a lot for your attention, and I will be happy to hear the feedback from you.
Okay, thank you, Philip, for your presentation. So we have 5 minutes for a short question to Philip's presentation. So are there any questions, specific questions regarding the methodology, regarding a topic, or regarding further ideas how to develop methodology further? Okay, so if there are not any specific questions on Philip's talk, then I would suggest to move on to our discussion round. And there's a first question from Alice, and Alice wants to talk. So the question is for Emily, sorry. So, and the question is, So if you could, Emily, speak to whether there have been any research findings about the impact of HEI closure on the local communities, and given that the result is likely negative, are there ways to curb the negative economic impact of HEI closure on surrounding local communities?
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks for the question. There has been a little research. So John Goddard at Newcastle and some colleagues have done some work on the relationship between institutional vulnerability and vulnerable places, and this is in England. They have a really nice index, and they did a principal components analysis to kind of try to pull out like what predicts institutional vulnerability and if there's any sort of place effects. And they did find some things about the population served by the institutions. And one I think that is really significant is where students were from. So institutions with more local student bases were more likely to close and to experience vulnerability, which I think has a lot of implications for the role of institutions in communities. And there's also been a little bit about, I guess from Brookings, my co-author is texting me, about counties that had a university having smaller employment losses during and after the Great Recession versus counties that didn't have one. So there is some research sort of on the importance of HEIs and their presence in local economies. In terms of curbing the effects, mostly, when an institution is facing closure, they're really focused on their own sort of viability. So they do things like we've already started to see in the US, like consolidating departments, ending majors, trying to attract more students. And so these decisions I think are really interesting, are things that we want to understand more. Like if you're making the decision to end a department and a major, like how is it that one chosen, right? How have you decided that that's no longer a relevant one? And it's probably very dependent on the population served and the mission of the institution. And in terms of what to do, what are other ways to curb these impacts, from the Goddard paper that I mentioned, their main takeaway was that this has to be an extremely context-specific policy intervention. Like there's less with large policy decisions, and it has to be very targeted because it's so dependent on population served, specific context of the institution. And so their recommendation is really that taking that fine-grained look at what can be done in this very localized context.
Okay, thanks. So once again, so if you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A section so that I can ask them, or our discussion presenters can see them. So maybe a short question also to Emily. So you mentioned that MSI pay significant high interest rates. So are there specific reasons why? So are there drivers which can be identified why they have to pay high interest rates? Is it because this is a market argument, or is financing housing or whatever, or is it different?
Yeah, I have to take a look. There's the paper that came out that got some coverage in the media was an economics paper that calculated the difference in interest rates. So I don't have it in front of me right now. But there are a lot of reasons that these institutions would be paying higher interest rates. So first of all, they receive credit scores from organizations like Moody's. And I've been sitting in on some of the Moody's calls about the future of higher education. And so, they're really interested in factors like how many students did you lose due to COVID-19? Like what is your enrollment drop? How safe is your endowment right now? How are alumni donations? Like all these indicators of financial viability and ability to repay, would go into the calculation of an interest rate given to institutions to, make capital investments. And like you mentioned, it's a very different situation than in the EU. Like in the US, all these institutions are very responsible for getting financing to do the things that they want to do, especially amid, kind of continued state and federal cuts to education. And so this interest rate differential becomes, just another burden on MSIs who are kind of struggling against these sort of racialized financial decisions that are sort of talked about in terms of these technical terms like what is your credit rating, but then have these really uneven effects in practice.
Okay, so there maybe a question to Philip. So I noticed our common paper, but nevertheless, so maybe you can say something about the political issues which are obviously missing in our paper so far. So so supporting green R&D programs or whatever. Maybe you can say something about that. How can we develop further our paper in this direction?
Yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah, with regard to this mentioned problem with the double externality, which that there's simply no sufficient market for green technologies, one could potentially control for the stringency of policy in order to check if there's an interaction effect, such that green technology has no effect until stringency is high enough, and then there emerges a small effect, for example. This could be a way to look at the policy dimension with regard to the pricing of environmental output or environmental harm. Yeah, that's my point to that.
Okay, so last chance for asking some further questions from the audience. So I don't see any further questions now. So if there are not any immediate questions, I would say thank you. Thank you so much to Emily and also to Philip for these very interesting presentations. Both were kind of different fields, but nevertheless very interesting, very important, I think. And yeah, thanks again. And I think we are now close at the end of our first day of the workshop. And yeah, tomorrow we start very early, so we start at 8 a.m. EST. Dirk is giving the welcome remarks, and yeah, and maybe I will take the chance to wrap up what we learned today. Maybe so we had quite different and I think very important and relevant presentations today, and I learned a lot. So we start in the first session with Cesar. Cesar talked about regional inequality, and we learn again that matrix algebra is very important for us to use them in empirical investigation. I learned a lot of the wage gap differentials in particular for Brazil. Then we have another, then we have Tom, and as the second speaker who presents something on creative destruction and inequality in the United States. Again, very important, and yeah, and again, I learned a lot. Then we had a second session, moderated by Dirk, starting with Frederick, who presents something about regional monopolies, and and particularly in the context of the information society, I think very important issues that should be tackled, not only in the United States, but also elsewhere in the world. Then we had Neil with a nice paper on inclusive innovation, which I think it's a very important avenue for further research. Nevertheless, the topic seems to be not well defined at the end of the day. And then we have our last section with Emily and Philip. Emily talked about the financial vulnerability in higher education in the United States and the potential impact on social inequality or inequality in a broader sense. And then we have Philip who gave a talk about the impact of green technology on regional performance for evidence for European regions. So I would thank, Marianne for giving, starting our workshop, introducing the topic, the major topic. Then, of course, I thank Dirk. I thank Alice. Alice, thank you so much for your support. And I also say thank you to the technical staff behind this Zoom meeting. And so I will be happy to see you tomorrow morning on our second part of the workshop. Thank you, and have a good day.